The whisper in the cellar. The wedding reception hall buzzed with excitement, adorned with fairy lights and cascading white roses. Guests sipped champagne, their laughter mingling with the soft melody of a string quartet. Jasmine stood near the entrance, radiant in her wedding gown, her smile wide, as she greeted each arriving guest. Her daughter, Maya, stood close by, her pink flower girl dress looking pristine. But her wide brown eyes, fixed on the crowd, betrayed a nervousness that seemed misplaced amidst the festivities. Maya had been quiet all morning. Her 9-year-old hands clutched her basket of rose petals with such force that the pink and red hues seemed to bleed together. The other children darted around the hall, squealing with joy, but Maya stayed still, watching everything with an intensity that seemed unnatural for her age. Jasmine knelt down, her lace train pooling on the floor. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she asked, gently brushing a stray curl from Maya's forehead. Maya nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm fine, Mom," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Jasmine smiled, though a flicker of concern crossed her face. "You'll be the most beautiful flower girl anyone has ever seen. Just drop the petals as we practiced, and everything will be perfect." Maya nodded again, her eyes darting toward her father, David, who stood a few feet away, chatting animatedly with a group of groomsmen. To anyone else, he looked the part of the charismatic groom, his tuxedo immaculate and his laughter infectious. But Maya's gaze lingered on him longer than necessary, her small frame tensing whenever his eyes briefly met hers. Jasmine rose, brushing off her concern. It was natural for Maya to be nervous on such a big day. She placed a soft kiss on her daughter's forehead and returned to the throng of guests, ready to immerse herself in the joy of her wedding day. Hours earlier, the air in the Thompson household had been far from celebratory. The morning sunlight seeped through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room. Wedding decorations filled every surface, from flower arrangements to delicate lace tablecloths. But the warmth of the decor did little to dispel the chill that hung in the air. The faint creak of a door echoed through the house. In the hallway, the cellar door stood slightly ajar, revealing the dark void beneath. From the shadows, a small figure emerged. Maya. Her feet were bare, her pink pajamas slightly rumpled. Her wide eyes darted around the room, her breath quickening as she climbed the final step. Behind her, the cellar door creaked shut. David appeared suddenly, stepping into the hallway with deliberate strides. His usually groomed hair was slightly disheveled, and his shirt hung loosely, as though hastily thrown on. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw betrayed an unspoken anger. Maya froze, her small hands gripping the hem of her shirt. "I didn't say anything," she said quickly, her voice barely audible. David's gaze bore into her, unyielding. "You remember what we talked about, right?" he said, his voice low and firm. Maya nodded, her eyes glued to the floor. "Yes, Dad." "Good," he said, stepping closer. His hand landed on her shoulder, heavy and deliberate. "You're a smart girl. You wouldn't want to ruin today, would you?" Maya shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. Satisfied, David's demeanor shifted. He ruffled Maya's hair in a mock display of affection. "Now, go get ready. You've got a big job today." Maya nodded again and hurried toward her bedroom, her small frame trembling with every step. David lingered in the hallway for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he glanced back at the cellar door. Then, with a sharp exhale, he adjusted his shirt and returned to the kitchen, where the scent of coffee filled the air. In her room, Maya closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart pounding in her chest. She pressed her hands against her mouth, stifling the sob that threatened to escape. On her nightstand sat a small photograph of her and Jasmine, taken at a park the previous summer. Maya reached for it, her fingers brushing against the glass. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to." A knock on the door startled her. Jasmine's cheerful voice came from the other side. "Sweetheart, Are you ready to get dressed? The photographer will be here soon." Maya quickly wiped her eyes, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Coming, Mom," she called, her voice trembling slightly. Back in the present, the ceremony was about to begin. The guests had taken their seats, and the string quartet played softly in the background. Jasmine stood with her bridesmaids, adjusting her veil one last time. She glanced over at Maya, who was standing with her flower basket at the entrance to the aisle. The little girl seemed even smaller now, dwarfed by the grandeur of the venue. David approached Maya, crouching down to whisper something in her ear. Jasmine watched from a distance, smiling at what appeared to be a tender father-daughter moment. But as David stood and walked away, Maya's face fell, her lips pressed tightly together. When the music swelled, signaling the start of the procession, Maya took a deep breath and stepped forward, scattering rose petals as she walked. The guests cooed and whispered about how adorable she looked, but Maya didn't hear them. Her gaze was fixed on Jasmine, a silent plea in her eyes. As Jasmine began her walk down the aisle, her heart swelled with love and joy. This was her moment, the culmination of everything she had dreamed of. But as her eyes briefly met Maya's, a flicker of unease crept in, a feeling she couldn't quite place. It was the beginning of a day that would unravel everything Jasmine thought she knew about her life, her love, and the man she was marrying. And as Maya stood at the altar, her tiny frame trembling, she knew she could no longer keep the secret she had been forced to bear. The stage was set, and the truth was about to come crashing down. Shadows behind smiles. The ceremony had gone off without a hitch, leaving the guests in a blissful haze of romance and celebration. Jasmine and David had exchanged their vows under a canopy of roses, their hands clasped tightly together as they pledged forever in front of friends and family. The applause as they kissed had been thunderous, and for a fleeting moment, Jasmine believed she was stepping into the happily ever after she'd always dreamed of. But Maya's silence lingered like a shadow, dimming the joy that Jasmine tried to hold on to. Now, at the reception, the room was a dazzling spectacle of twinkling lights, pastel flowers, and the gentle hum of conversation. Jasmine sat at the head table beside David, her newly minted husband, who was animatedly recounting the story of how they first met to a small crowd of friends. Jasmine glanced at Maya, who sat at the far end of the table, staring down at her untouched plate of food. The soft pink flower girl dress that had made her look like a fairy tale princess earlier now seemed to hang off her shoulders as though it were a burden too heavy to bear. Her small hands lay in her lap, clenched into tight fists. Jasmine leaned over to Sarah, her maid of honor and best friend, who was seated nearby. "Does Maya seem off to you?" she asked in a hushed voice. Sarah followed Jasmine's gaze and frowned. "She does look a little quiet. Maybe she's just tired." "Tired," Jasmine echoed, but the word didn't feel right. Maya's quietness had gone beyond fatigue. It was something heavier, darker. Jasmine couldn't shake the image of her daughter's tense face during the ceremony, the way she had avoided looking at David. Before she could dwell on it further, David tapped his glass with a knife, drawing the attention of the room. "A toast," he declared, standing tall and confident. The guests cheered, lifting their glasses as David launched into a heartfelt speech about love, family, and the future. Jasmine smiled, her cheeks flushing as David sang her praises. His words were beautiful, the kind that left the room misty-eyed and sighing. But even as he spoke, Jasmine noticed something odd. His free hand rested on Maya's shoulder, his fingers pressing firmly into her small frame. Maya sat frozen under his touch, her face pale, her gaze fixed on the floor. A knot of unease formed in Jasmine's stomach. She couldn't place why, but the sight unsettled her. She reached for her champagne flute to steady herself and took a long sip, her eyes never leaving her daughter. Hours earlier, in the quiet stillness of the Thompson home, Maya had been locked in the cellar again. The space was small and dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of a single bulb. An old sofa sat in the corner, its fabric torn and worn. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew. Maya sat on the sofa, her knees pulled to her chest, her tiny frame trembling. David had brought her down just before Jasmine returned home from a last-minute wedding errand. His voice had been calm but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. "You'll stay here until I say so," he told her, his hand gripping her shoulder with an iron grip. "If you make a sound, I'll know. And if you tell your mother." He'd left the threat hanging, his words trailing off into silence that felt more ominous than anything he could have said. Maya had nodded, her eyes wide with fear, as David locked the door behind him. She hadn't dared move, hadn't dared cry. Instead, she sat silently, counting the minutes, her ears straining to hear the faint sounds of the world beyond the cellar door. When the lock finally clicked and the door opened, David's face appeared, his expression unreadable. Upstairs. Now. Maya had scurried past him, her small feet moving as quickly as they could carry her. She hadn't looked back, hadn't dared to meet his eyes. Now, as the reception continued, Maya sat quietly, her plate untouched, her appetite non-existent. The laughter and clinking glasses around her seemed like a distant echo, muffled by the pounding of her heart. She felt David's gaze on her, heavy and unrelenting, and the memory of the cellar tightened around her like a noose. Sarah approached her, pulling up a chair and offering her a warm smile. "Hey, sweet pea," she said softly. "You look like you could use a friend. Mind if I join you?" Maya looked up, startled, and nodded quickly. Sarah sat down and leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "What's going on, Maya? You've been awfully quiet today." Maya hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress. She glanced toward David, who was engrossed in conversation at the other end of the table. For a moment, she considered telling Sarah everything. About the cellar, about the women who visited when Jasmine wasn't home, about the threats David had made. But fear clamped her throat shut, and she shook her head. "Nothing," she murmured. "I'm just tired." Sarah frowned, unconvinced. "You sure? You can tell me anything, sweetheart. I'm here for you." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away and forced a smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely audible. Before Sarah could press further, David appeared behind Maya, his smile wide but his eyes sharp. "There you are, princess," he said, his tone cheerful but his presence oppressive. "Why don't you come dance with me? Show everyone those moves we've been practicing." Maya flinched at the word princess, but she nodded obediently, letting David guide her away. Sarah watched them go, unease curling in her gut. Something wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong. Later that evening, as the guests took to the dance floor and the energy in the room swelled, Jasmine couldn't ignore the tension any longer. She found Sarah near the dessert table and pulled her aside. "Something's wrong with Maya," Jasmine said, her voice low and urgent. "She's been acting so strange all day. I thought it was just nerves, but now, I don't know." Sarah hesitated, biting her lip. "I think you're right," she said finally. "I tried talking to her earlier, but she wouldn't open up. And David." She trailed off, glancing toward the dance floor where David spun Maya in a slow, awkward circle. "I don't like the way he's been acting." Jasmine's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know. It's just a feeling. But something about the way he looks at her, it doesn't sit right with me." Jasmine followed Sarah's gaze, watching as David pulled Maya close, his hand resting on her shoulder. Maya's face was pale, her smile forced, and her small frame seemed to shrink under David's touch. A cold knot of dread formed in Jasmine's chest. She didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it. But as she watched her daughter, the truth she'd been avoiding began to creep in, insidious and undeniable. Something was terribly wrong, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Cracks beneath the surface. The lights at the reception dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow across the hall. The music swelled as couples swayed together on the dance floor, their laughter and smiles a stark contrast to the turmoil bubbling beneath the surface for Jasmine and Maya. At the head table, Jasmine sat alone, staring down at the untouched slice of wedding cake on her plate. David had excused himself, blending seamlessly into the crowd with his broad, easy smile that masked the tension only she could sense. Her eyes shifted to Maya, sitting at the far end of the room. The little girl's small figure seemed almost swallowed by the oversized chair she occupied. Her flower girl dress, once a symbol of innocence and celebration, now looked more like a shroud. Jasmine watched as Maya sat rigid, her hands clutching the edge of the table. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Jasmine's chest tightened with a growing sense of unease. This wasn't the behavior of an excited child at her mother's wedding. Something was wrong. And no matter how much Jasmine tried to shake the thought, it clung to her like a shadow. Earlier that afternoon, just before the ceremony, Jasmine had walked into Maya's bedroom to find her daughter sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor. Maya's small hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Jasmine had asked, her voice gentle, as she knelt in front of her daughter. Maya looked up, her big brown eyes filled with a sadness that Jasmine couldn't place. "I'm fine, Mom," she said softly, but her tone lacked any conviction. Jasmine reached out and took Maya's hands in her own. "You don't seem fine, baby. Are you nervous about the wedding? You're going to be the most beautiful flower girl." Maya hesitated, her gaze darting toward the door. I just want you to be happy," she whispered. Jasmine's heart swelled with emotion. She wrapped her arms around Maya, pulling her into a tight hug. "I am happy," she said. "This is the happiest day of my life, and having you here makes it even more perfect." Maya clung to her mother for a moment before pulling away. Her smile was faint, but it didn't reach her eyes. Jasmine didn't notice, too caught up in her own excitement to see the fear lingering in her daughter's expression. Now, as Jasmine watched Maya from across the reception hall, the memory came back to her with an uncomfortable clarity. Something was deeply troubling her daughter. Jasmine could feel it in her bones. She stood, smoothing the delicate lace of her wedding gown, and made her way across the room. Guests smiled and congratulated her as she passed, their words barely registering. Her focus was fixed entirely on Maya. When she reached the table, she knelt beside her daughter. "Maya," she said softly, placing a hand on her small arm. "Sweetheart, talk to me. What's wrong?" Maya's head jerked up, her eyes wide with alarm. She glanced quickly around the room, her gaze landing on David, who was standing near the bar, laughing with a group of friends. When she looked back at Jasmine, her lips quivered, and tears welled up in her eyes. I'm okay, Mom," she said, her voice shaky. Jasmine frowned. "You don't seem okay, baby. Please, tell me what's going on." Before Maya could respond, David's voice cut through the noise of the reception. "There you are, Princess," he said, his tone overly bright as he approached. "I've been looking for you." Maya stiffened, her entire body going rigid under Jasmine's hand. Jasmine noticed it immediately and felt a wave of unease wash over her. David crouched down beside them, his smile broad. "Why don't you come dance with your old man?" he asked, holding out his hand. Maya hesitated, her small fingers clenching the edge of the table. She looked at Jasmine, her eyes pleading. Jasmine opened her mouth to speak, but David had already taken Maya's hand, pulling her gently but firmly to her feet. "Come on," he said, "let's show everyone how it's done." Maya cast one last glance at her mother before letting herself be led to the dance floor. Jasmine watched them go, her stomach twisting into knots. Something about the interaction felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on it. As the evening wore on, Jasmine found herself sitting with Sarah at a quiet corner of the room. Sarah had always been her rock, the one person she could count on to tell her the truth no matter how hard it was to hear. "Sarah," Jasmine began, her voice low, "do you think Maya's okay?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the dance floor where Maya was standing off to the side, looking small and out of place amidst the revelry. "Honestly," she said. "No. I've been watching her all night. She looks scared, Jasmine. And the way she keeps shrinking away from David." Jasmine's heart sank. "You've noticed it too?" Sarah nodded. "I didn't want to say anything, but something's off. I don't know what it is, but Maya's not herself." Jasmine felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "What do I do, Sarah? What if?" She didn't finish the sentence. The words felt too heavy, too impossible to speak aloud. Sarah placed a comforting hand on Jasmine's arm. "You need to talk to her. Alone. Find out what's going on." Jasmine nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right. I'll talk to her." Later that night, after most of the guests had gone, and the reception was winding down, Jasmine found Maya sitting alone near the back of the hall. The little girl was clutching her flower basket, her head bowed. Jasmine knelt beside her, taking her hands. "Maya," she said softly, "it's just us now. You can tell me anything." Maya hesitated, her lip trembling. Her eyes darted around the room before landing on Jasmine's face. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of speaking, but then her gaze shifted to something, or someone, behind Jasmine. Jasmine turned to see David standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone calm, but his presence heavy. Maya immediately withdrew, pulling her hands away from Jasmine's. "I'm fine," she said quickly. Jasmine's heart broke as she watched her daughter retreat into herself. She looked up at David, her own unease mounting. Something was very wrong, and she was determined to find out what, even if it meant shattering the illusion of the perfect day she had worked so hard to create. The cracks beneath the surface were growing, and Jasmine knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The breaking point. The reception hall had emptied, leaving behind only a handful of staff cleaning up the remnants of a day that should have been one of Jasmine's happiest. The scent of crushed rose petals lingered in the air, mingling with the faint tang of spilled champagne. The dimmed lights created long shadows that seemed to stretch across the space, wrapping it in an uneasy quiet. Jasmine sat at the head table, still in her wedding gown, her hands resting on the pristine white tablecloth. Her gaze was distant, fixed on the delicate floral arrangement in the center of the table, though her mind was elsewhere. Across the room, David was chatting with one of the staff members, his movements animated as he gestured toward the exit. His laughter rang out, loud and carefree, but to Jasmine it felt forced, like a mask he was desperate to keep in place. Maya sat nearby, perched on the edge of a chair, her small hands clutching the hem of her dress. Her legs dangled above the floor, swinging nervously. Her wide brown eyes darted between Jasmine and David, her lips pressed tightly together, as though holding back words she didn't dare speak. Jasmine's thoughts churned. Maya had barely eaten all evening, and her stiff, unnatural movements had been impossible to ignore. Even more troubling was the way she recoiled whenever David came near. Jasmine replayed the events of the day in her mind, her earlier doubts now magnified. The strange tension, Maya's flinching, the way David seemed to hover just a little too close to their daughter. It all pointed to something Jasmine couldn't yet name, but could no longer deny. Jasmine took a deep breath and pushed her chair back. The sound scraped through the quiet room, causing both Maya and David to glance her way. "David," she called, her voice steady but firm. "Could you give us a moment? I need to speak with Maya." David's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "Sure, babe," he said, his tone light. "But don't keep her up too late. Big day for everyone." Jasmine nodded curtly, waiting until he disappeared into the adjoining lounge before turning her full attention to Maya. She knelt in front of her daughter, placing her hands gently on Maya's trembling knees. "Maya," she began softly, her voice laced with both love and urgency. "I need you to tell me what's been going on. Whatever it is, you don't have to be afraid. I'm here." Maya's lower lip quivered, and her hands twisted the fabric of her dress. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't." "Yes, you can, sweetheart," Jasmine said, squeezing Maya's hands. "You can tell me anything. I promise I'll believe you." Maya hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. She glanced toward the lounge where David had gone, then back at Jasmine. "He'll get mad," she said finally, her voice breaking. Jasmine's heart clenched. "Who? Maya? David? Is he the one making you feel like this?" Maya nodded slowly, tears spilling over her cheeks. "He locks me in the cellar when you're not home," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "He says I have to be quiet and stay there so I don't ruin anything. And," she hesitated, her small shoulders shaking, "and sometimes he brings other people to the house." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations, moments she had dismissed, and the overwhelming fear in Maya's eyes. "Other people," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya nodded again. "He tells me not to say anything. He says if I do, something bad will happen." Jasmine's stomach churned. She felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. This was more than she could have ever imagined, worse than her darkest fears. "Oh, Maya." Jasmine pulled her daughter into a tight embrace, feeling the small, trembling body in her arms. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have seen." The sound of a throat clearing interrupted her. Jasmine looked up to see David standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, though his eyes held a sharpness that sent a chill down her spine. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but cold. Jasmine straightened, keeping one arm protectively around Maya. "We're talking," she said, her tone measured. David's gaze shifted to Maya, who shrank further into Jasmine's side. "Talking about what?" Jasmine stood, positioning herself between David and their daughter. "About you," she said, her voice hardening. "Maya told me everything, David. The cellar, the threats, the other women." For the first time all night, David's mask slipped. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darted to Maya, then back to Jasmine. "She doesn't know what she's talking about," he said quickly, a nervous laugh escaping him. "She's a kid. Kids make things up." "She's not making this up," Jasmine shot back, her voice rising. "She's terrified of you. I see it. I've been seeing it all day, and I ignored it because I wanted to believe you were the man I thought I knew. But you're not." David's expression darkened, his veneer of charm crumbling. "You're overreacting," he said, stepping closer. "This is ridiculous. You're going to believe a child over your husband." Jasmine didn't back down. "I am her mother," she said firmly, "and I will always believe her. Now step back, David." David's lips curled into a sneer, but he didn't move. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "No," Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "The only mistake I made was not seeing this sooner." She turned to Maya and knelt again, her hands on the girl's shoulders. "Maya, go to the kitchen and find Sarah. Stay with her, okay?" Maya hesitated, glancing nervously at David. Jasmine cupped her daughter's face gently. "It's okay, baby. I won't let him hurt you. Go." Maya nodded and darted toward the kitchen, her small feet barely making a sound on the polished floor. When she was gone, Jasmine stood to face David. The man she had loved, the man she had pledged her life to mere hours ago, was now a stranger, a monster hiding behind a charming facade. "I want you out of this house," Jasmine said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You don't get to be part of our lives anymore." David's face twisted in anger. "You can't just throw me out. We're married. We're done," Jasmine snapped. "You can explain yourself to the police." David's eyes widened, but before he could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her phone in hand. "I've already called them," she said, her voice steady. "They'll be here soon." David glared at both women, his jaw tightening as he weighed his options. For a moment, he looked like he might lash out, but the sound of approaching sirens in the distance seemed to deflate him. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the house, the door slamming shut behind him. Jasmine collapsed into a chair, her body trembling with the weight of what had just happened. Sarah sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing," Sarah said softly. Jasmine nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I just want Maya to be safe," she whispered. "She will be," Sarah assured her. "You both will." As the sirens grew louder, Jasmine took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The truth had shattered her perfect day, but it had also set her free. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt the strength to rebuild her life. This time, with Maya's safety and happiness at the center. Fractured foundations. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, the sound cutting through the quiet of the empty reception hall like a blade. Jasmine sat at the head table, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the tablecloth. Sarah stood nearby, her phone still in hand, her face pale but resolute. The once celebratory space now felt like a hollow shell, the remnants of the evening scattered around them. Empty glasses, wilting flowers, and the faint scent of uneaten cake lingering in the air. Maya was in the kitchen, curled up in the protective embrace of Jasmine's mother. Jasmine had checked on her moments ago, reassuring her daughter that everything would be okay. But as the sirens neared, Jasmine felt the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down on her chest. She had spent years building a life with David, believing in the love they shared, and now it was unraveling before her eyes. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hall as two uniformed police officers entered. Their presence was a stark contrast to the elegance of the venue, their somber expressions setting the tone for what was to come. "Mrs. Thompson," one of them asked, his gaze flicking to Jasmine. Jasmine swallowed hard, rising to her feet. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm Jasmine Thompson." The officer nodded, his tone professional but kind. "We received a call regarding a domestic situation. Can you tell us what happened?" Jasmine's throat felt dry as she gestured toward Sarah. "My friend called," she said. "She can explain what's been going on." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady as she recounted the events of the evening. She explained Maya's behavior, her fear of David, and the disturbing revelations about the cellar and the threats. Jasmine listened silently, her heart pounding as she relived the moments that had led to this. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. "Where is David Thompson now?" one of them asked. "He left," Jasmine said. "When Sarah called the police, he stormed out." "Do you know where he might have gone?" the officer pressed. Jasmine shook her head. "I don't." But she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "You have to find him. He's dangerous." The officer nodded. "We'll do everything we can to locate him," he said. "For now, we'd like to speak with your daughter." Jasmine's chest tightened. She hated the idea of Maya having to relive what she'd been through, but she also knew it was necessary. "She's in the kitchen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll go with you." The officers followed Jasmine to the kitchen, where Maya sat at the small table, her tiny frame huddled against her grandmother. Her wide eyes flicked to the uniformed men, her body tensing instinctively. "It's okay, sweetheart," Jasmine said gently, kneeling beside her daughter. "These officers are here to help us. They just want to ask you a few questions." Maya looked at Jasmine, her eyes brimming with uncertainty. "Will he come back?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jasmine's heart broke at the question. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Maya's face. "No, baby," she said firmly. "He's not coming back. I won't let him hurt you again." Maya hesitated, then nodded slowly. Her small hand found Jasmine's, clinging tightly as one of the officers crouched to her level. "Hi, Maya," the officer said, his tone gentle. "My name is Officer Daniels. I'm here to make sure you and your mom are safe." Can you tell me a little bit about what's been happening?" Maya glanced at Jasmine, who gave her an encouraging nod. Slowly, haltingly, the little girl began to speak. She described the cellar, the damp, dark space where David would lock her when Jasmine wasn't home. She talked about the women who came to the house and the threats David would make to keep her silent. Her voice wavered with every word, but she pushed through, her small body trembling with the effort. Jasmine fought back tears as she listened, her nails digging into her palms. Each word felt like a knife, cutting deeper into the image of the man she had thought she knew. How had she missed this? How had she let her daughter endure so much pain? When Maya finished, Officer Daniels nodded, his expression grim but sympathetic. "You're very brave, Maya," he said. "Thank you for telling me. You did the right thing." Maya's grip on Jasmine's hand tightened, and Jasmine pulled her daughter into a protective embrace. "It's over now," she whispered. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." The hours that followed were a blur. The police took Jasmine's statement, asking for details about David's behavior and any signs she might have missed. They assured her that they would do everything in their power to find him and keep her and Maya safe. A restraining order was issued immediately, and an officer was assigned to patrol the area near their home. Sarah stayed by Jasmine's side throughout the ordeal, her presence a steadying force. When the officers finally left, promising to keep her updated, Jasmine sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over her. Sarah handed her a glass of water and sat beside her. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "You protected Maya. That's what matters." Jasmine nodded, though the weight of guilt still lingered. "I should have seen it," she said. "I should have known." "You can't blame yourself," Sarah said firmly. "He hid it well. He manipulated you, but you saw the truth when it mattered, and you acted. That's what counts." Jasmine glanced toward the kitchen, where Maya was now asleep in her grandmother's arms. Her small face was peaceful, but Jasmine knew the scars of what she'd endured would take time to heal. "I just want her to feel safe again," Jasmine said quietly. "She will," Sarah said. "And so will you. You're stronger than you think, Jasmine." Jasmine took a deep breath, letting Sarah's words sink in. The perfect life she had envisioned was gone, shattered by betrayal and pain. But as she looked at Maya, she realized that the pieces could be rebuilt, not into the life she had planned, but into one where her daughter's safety and happiness came first. It wouldn't be easy. There would be questions, judgments, and nights filled with doubt and fear. But for Maya's sake, Jasmine knew she would face it all. Because no matter what, they had each other. And that was enough to start again. The dawn of healing. The morning after the wedding that wasn't felt surreal. Jasmine woke up in the guest bedroom at Sarah's house, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on her, each memory sharp and unrelenting. She turned her head and saw Maya curled up beside her, her small frame barely making a dent in the mattress. Her daughter's breathing was steady, her face peaceful in sleep, but Jasmine knew that the wounds inside would take far longer to mend. Jasmine carefully slipped out of bed, tucking the blanket around Maya. Her legs felt unsteady as she made her way to the kitchen, where Sarah was already up, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the faint aroma of pancakes from a pan still warm on the stove. "You didn't sleep, did you?" Jasmine asked, her voice still rough from exhaustion. Sarah glanced up, her expression soft. "Not much," she admitted. "But I'm not the one who just had her life turned upside down. How are you holding up?" Jasmine sighed, running her hands through her hair. "I don't even know. It still doesn't feel real. One minute, I was walking down the aisle, thinking I had the perfect life. And the next." Her voice broke, and she shook her head. "I feel like I've failed Maya." Sarah set her mug down and crossed the room, pulling Jasmine into a firm hug. "You didn't fail her," she said firmly. "You protected her. You listened to her when it mattered. That's what a good mother does." Jasmine nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah pulled back and looked at her. "One step at a time," she said. "For now, focus on keeping Maya safe and letting her know she's loved. Everything else can wait." When Maya woke up, her eyes fluttering open as sunlight streamed through the window, Jasmine was sitting on the edge of the bed, brushing a hand gently through her daughter's hair. Maya blinked, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar room before landing on her mother. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice soft. "We're at Aunt Sarah's house," Jasmine said gently. "We're going to stay here for a little while, just until everything settles down." Maya sat up, her small hands clutching the blanket. Is he gone?" she whispered. Jasmine's heart broke at the fear in her daughter's voice. She leaned forward, cupping Maya's face in her hands. "Yes, baby," she said firmly. "He's gone, and he's not coming back. I promise." Maya nodded, her lower lip trembling. She leaned into her mother, wrapping her arms around Jasmine's neck. Jasmine held her tightly, her heart swelling with both love and resolve. She wouldn't let anything, or anyone, hurt her daughter again. The next few days were a whirlwind of adjustments and difficult conversations. Jasmine met with the police, who assured her that David was under investigation and a restraining order was in place. She contacted a lawyer to discuss her legal options, determined to annul the marriage, and ensure David had no way to contact her or Maya. Maya, meanwhile, began therapy with a child psychologist recommended by Sarah. At first, the sessions were difficult. Maya was hesitant to open up, her trust in adults shattered by the man who had betrayed her. But gradually, with gentle guidance, she began to share her experiences, her fears, and her hopes. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional session, Maya came to Jasmine with a question that caught her off guard. "Mom," she said hesitantly, her small hands twisting the hem of her shirt. Do you think I'll ever feel okay again?" Jasmine knelt in front of her daughter, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "It might take time, and it might be hard sometimes, but you will feel okay again. I promise." Maya nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She reached out and took Jasmine's hand, holding it tightly. "As long as we're together," she said, her voice small but strong. "I think I can be okay." Weeks turned into months, and slowly the pieces of their lives began to come together again. Jasmine found a new place to live, a small but cozy apartment where she and Maya could start fresh. She quit her job and found one with more flexible hours, determined to be there for her daughter as much as possible. The scars of the past didn't fade overnight. Maya still had nightmares, and Jasmine often found herself waking up in the middle of the night to comfort her. There were moments of doubt, of anger, and of grief for the life they had lost. But there were also moments of joy, small victories that felt monumental in their significance. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Maya leaned against her mother's side, her head resting on Jasmine's shoulder. "Mom," she said, her voice quiet, "I'm glad it's just us now." Jasmine wrapped an arm around her daughter, pulling her close. "Me too, sweetheart," she said. "Me too." The day they finalized the annulment was both bittersweet and empowering. Jasmine walked out of the courthouse with her head held high, the weight of David's betrayal finally lifted from her shoulders. Sarah was waiting for her outside, her grin wide, and her arms open for a celebratory hug. "You did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with pride. "We did it," Jasmine corrected, glancing at Maya, who was holding Sarah's hand. "I couldn't have done this without you." Maya smiled, her small face lit with a joy Jasmine hadn't seen in months. "We're a team," she said simply. Jasmine knelt in front of her daughter, cupping her face. "Yes, we are," she said. "And as long as we're together, nothing can break us." For the first time in what felt like forever, Jasmine believed it. The shadows of the past would always linger, but they no longer defined their future. Together, they would build a new life, one filled with love, safety, and the promise of brighter days ahead. And for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt hope. A new beginning. A few weeks after the annulment was finalized, Jasmine and Maya began settling into their new apartment. It was a modest space, with 2 small bedrooms and a cozy living room. But to them, it felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could finally breathe. The walls were painted a warm cream, and sunlight poured in through the large windows, illuminating the simple furniture that Sarah had helped them pick out. Jasmine stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta sauce as the aroma of garlic and tomatoes filled the air. Maya sat at the dining table nearby, a crayon in hand as she worked on a drawing. Her tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, and for the first time in months, Jasmine saw a spark of joy in her daughter's eyes. "What are you working on, sweetie?" Jasmine asked, her voice soft. Maya looked up and smiled. "It's us," she said, holding up the paper. The drawing showed 2 figures, a tall woman with curly hair and a little girl in a pink dress, standing in front of a house with a rainbow overhead. Jasmine's chest tightened with emotion. "It's beautiful," she said, walking over to admire the drawing. "Is that our new home?" Maya nodded. "Yeah, and the rainbow means things are getting better." Jasmine knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a gentle hug. "You're right," she whispered. "Things are getting better. And they're only going to keep getting better, because we're in this together." Maya hugged her back tightly, and for the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt a deep sense of peace. A month later, Jasmine took Maya to her first soccer practice at a local community center. Maya had been hesitant at first, worried about being around new people, but Jasmine had encouraged her gently, reminding her that it was okay to try new things at her own pace. As they arrived at the field, Maya's eyes widened at the sight of the other kids running and laughing, their cleats kicking up bits of grass as they chased a soccer ball. Jasmine crouched down to her daughter's level, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Jasmine said. "But if you want to join in, I'll be right here cheering you on." Maya hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, Mom," she said, her voice small but determined. Jasmine watched as Maya took tentative steps toward the field. A kind-looking coach waved her over, introducing her to the other kids. To Jasmine's surprise and delight, it didn't take long for Maya to join in the game, her laughter ringing out as she kicked the ball and raced alongside her new teammates. Tears filled Jasmine's eyes as she watched her daughter play. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a sign that Maya was beginning to heal, to rediscover the joy and confidence that had been taken from her. One evening, as Jasmine tucked Maya into bed, her daughter looked up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Mom," Maya said, her voice soft, "do you think we'll ever see him again?" Jasmine's stomach tightened, but she kept her tone calm. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but we've done everything we can to make sure we're safe. The police and the court are on our side. And I promise, if he ever tries to come near us again, I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." Maya nodded, her small hand reaching out to grasp Jasmine's. "I believe you, Mom," she said. "I'm not as scared anymore." Jasmine's heart swelled with pride and relief. "That's because you're brave," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Maya's face. "And no matter what happens, we'll face it together. Always." Maya smiled, her eyes heavy with sleep. "I love you, Mom," she murmured. "I love you too, baby," Jasmine said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "More than anything." The months turned into a year, and life gradually began to feel normal again. Maya continued therapy, her confidence growing with each passing week. Jasmine found a steady job that allowed her to spend afternoons with her daughter, and the 2 of them fell into a comfortable routine filled with movie nights, weekend outings, and quiet evenings reading together. David was never heard from again. The restraining order and the ongoing police investigation ensured that he remained out of their lives. And though the trauma of the past would always linger in their memories, it no longer defined them. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their apartment watching the sunset, Maya turned to her mother with a smile. "Mom," she said, "I think we're happy now." Jasmine looked at her daughter, her heart full. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "I think we are." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jasmine truly believed it. Together, they had faced the darkness and come out stronger. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a golden glow, Jasmine knew that this was only the beginning of their brighter, safer future.